At exactly 4:47 on a cold Sunday morning, my brother Julian snatched a set of keys from a kitchen drawer and crashed a brand new vehicle into a ditch. My father Arthur woke me up with a frantic phone call and screamed at me through the receiver for 20 solid minutes. He called me a selfish daughter who only cared about herself. He called me a vindictive person. He firmly stated that my rigid, unyielding attitude had finally ruined our entire family structure. But here is the twisted little truth that still brings a genuine, warm smile to my face whenever I think about the sheer chaos of that morning. It was not my new cherry red Honda CR-V that ended up violently wrecked around a twisted metal guardrail on the slippery curves of Route 315. Not even close. It was my dad's precious, custom-ordered, $86,000 Lincoln Navigator, the exact luxury SUV he washed by hand and treated better than human beings. And Julian? He deliberately stole that massive truck in a blind panic, completely convinced that our father would just open his checkbook and forgive him. Because that is exactly how the script always went. But welcome to my story, the one where the golden boy finally ran out of second chances. My name is Clara. I am 31 years old, and until about 6 months ago, I was completely used to being the invisible daughter in a household that seemingly only possessed a heartbeat for my younger brother. I grew up in Pine Ridge, Colorado, one of those freezing, tightly knit mountain towns where everyone recognizes your winter coat and local gossip spreads faster than a wildfire in dry pine. My father, Arthur, built a custom furniture company from absolute scratch. He started sanding wood in our cramped garage when I was barely a toddler, eventually expanding it into the most lucrative interior woodwork business in Boulder County. At his peak, he managed over 40 employees. He treated that woodshop like his firstborn. Actually, scratch that, he looked at his oak tables with more pride than he ever looked at me. Then there is my mother, Martha. If I had to describe her career, I would say she is a professional peacekeeper. Her entire philosophy for navigating life could be neatly folded into 4 simple words: please do not argue. Whenever the temperature in the room dropped and tension flared, her immediate reaction was always to plaster on a smile, smooth down her apron, and pretend the house wasn't actively catching fire. Above all else, her cardinal rule was to never, ever upset Arthur or my brother. Speaking of the devil, let me introduce you to Julian, the golden child of the family. He is a 28-year-old man who still hauls his dirty laundry to my mother's house every single Sunday afternoon, claiming his apartment washer just doesn't get his gym clothes fluffy enough. I am not exaggerating when I say he is utterly helpless in the real world. Last Christmas, he literally asked me if he could put aluminum foil in the microwave to heat up a slice of leftover pizza. I just stared at his blank face for what felt like an eternity before pouring myself a generous glass of bourbon. Some questions simply do not warrant a verbal response. Julian has been on my father's payroll since he flunked out of a state college at 20. I am using the word work here with extreme generosity. He usually strolls into the furniture showroom around 10 in the morning, takes a leisurely 3-hour lunch break at the local sports bar, heads home by 3, and still has the audacity to complain about being exhausted. My dad pays him an astronomical salary for this phantom labor. I know this because I once helped my mom organize tax documents and accidentally saw his W-2. Meanwhile, I clawed my way up from a basic teller scanning checks to an assistant manager at Landmark Credit Union over 8 grueling years. Do you think my father ever asked how my career was going? Not even once. If I ever pointed out this glaring double standard, I was immediately labeled as a selfish person who didn't understand family loyalty. But this story is about how reality finally collected its long overdue debt. But what truly gets under my skin is the financial double standard. Over the last 5 years, my brother has borrowed exactly $3,400 from my savings. $100 for groceries here, $200 for a weekend ski trip there. Always accompanied by the exact same hollow promise. I will wire it to you on Friday, Clara. Friday, of course, is a complete myth. When I carefully brought this up to my dad once just a single time, he glared at me as if I had suggested selling Julian to a traveling circus. Family members are not keeping score, Clara, he snapped at me. That is your core flaw. You always want to tally things up. Really? Because Julian keeps a meticulous inventory of his vintage watch collection. The entitled man owns timepieces that cost triple my monthly rent. But sure, Dad, I am the one with the behavioral issue. A month before the incident, I finally did something massive just for me. I purchased my very first brand new car, a stunning cherry red Honda CR-V. Before that, I was driving a rusted 2011 Chevy Impala with 210,000 miles on the dashboard. The heater was permanently broken, the radio only played static, and making a sharp right turn produced a mechanical shriek that sounded like a dying bird. I endured that metal trap for 8 long years, quietly hoarding $9,500 penny by penny, paycheck by paycheck, for a solid down payment on a vehicle that was entirely mine. When I pulled that Honda off the dealership lot, I sat in a nearby parking lot and cried for 10 minutes. They were not sad tears, they were tears of pure triumph. That car was my tangible proof of survival, a symbol of everything I had painstakingly built without a dime of family money or nepotism. Arthur's reaction when I proudly parked my new car in the driveway? "Why didn't you buy something locally made?" He grunted this while leaning against his pristine, precious $86,000 Lincoln Navigator. He didn't even need a truck that size. He just craved a heavy machine that made other drivers feel inferior on the road. That SUV was his entire ego wrapped in chrome. Let's compare this to history. When my brother turned 25, Arthur bought him a fully loaded Ford Bronco, wrote a check for the full amount, slapped a massive velvet bow on the hood, and handed him the keys in our driveway like a cheesy television commercial. When I turned 25, Arthur handed me a paper envelope containing a premium AAA towing membership. He claimed it was a practical investment. He wasn't entirely wrong. I used it 4 times that winter when my Impala stalled in the snow, but the stark contrast speaks volumes. A luxury off-road beast versus emergency roadside assistance. The math of his affection was crystal clear. The weekend that shattered everything began exactly like every other Sunday family dinner at my parents' house. Sunday evening, 6:30 p.m., pot roast, mashed potatoes, and a thick glaze of passive aggression. I drove over in my beautiful new Honda CR-V and intentionally parked it right behind Arthur's Lincoln Navigator in the wide driveway. That was my designated, usual spot whenever I visited. Right behind my dad's car, a painfully obvious metaphor that I didn't fully comprehend until the dust settled later. I walked inside only to find Martha frantically pacing the kitchen, rushing to finish the green bean casserole because Julian was, predictably, late again. He finally rolled through the front door a full 45 minutes after dinner was supposed to officially start. He offered no apology, no reasonable explanation. He just shrugged and muttered, "Traffic was a nightmare." Keep in mind, he lives exactly 10 minutes away, and there is literally never traffic in Pine Ridge because there is never anything happening in Pine Ridge. Did my father say a single word about Julian disrespecting everyone's time? Of course not. He just clapped him hard on the shoulder and boomed, "There is my boy. Grab a cold one. Dinner is almost ready." I guarantee you, if I had been 45 minutes late, I would have received a blistering lecture about punctuality, respect, and fundamental responsibility. Julian got a frosty Coors Light and a beaming smile. During dinner, Julian started rambling about some revolutionary business opportunity he was supposedly developing. A buddy from the gym had an idea for a mobile app that would help people find local hiking trails. Except, that app already exists, and it is called All Trails. My dad nodded along vigorously, acting as if Julian was pitching the next Apple. That is smart thinking, son. Real entrepreneurial spirit right there. I honestly wanted to bang my forehead repeatedly against the dining table. When there was finally a brief pause in the Julian appreciation hour, I quietly mentioned that I had successfully handled a complex wire fraud case at work that week. An elderly customer had been scammed out of $18,500, and I had spent 4 grueling weeks working tirelessly with our corporate fraud department to recover every single penny. I was genuinely proud of it. It was incredibly difficult, high-stakes work, and I had helped someone who desperately needed it. Arthur's response? He took a bite of pot roast. "That is nice, honey. Hey, Julian, how is your golf swing coming along? Are you still slicing the ball on the back nine?" "That is nice, honey. 4 weeks of intense investigative work, $18,500 recovered for a vulnerable senior citizen, and all I got was, 'That is nice, honey,' followed immediately by a deep dive into golf mechanics. I abruptly excused myself to help my mom with the dirty dishes because I desperately needed to submerge my hands in scalding, soapy water before I wrapped them tightly around my brother's neck. I need to back up slightly and detail exactly what happened right after dinner, because there was a fierce confrontation that directly triggered the disaster. After the dishes were scrubbed, Julian cornered me by the refrigerator while Martha was upstairs, and Arthur was absorbed in a golf tournament in the living room. Julian had that specific irritating expression on his face, the one he gets when he wants a favor and has already decided he absolutely deserves it. His girlfriend, Chloe, needed to be picked up from the Denver International Airport the following morning. Her flight was landing at 6 a.m., which is a solid 2-hour drive from Pine Ridge. Julian's Ford Bronco was making a weird grinding noise, which I later discovered just meant he was almost out of gas and didn't want to pay to fill his massive tank for the long drive to Denver and back. Therefore, he wanted to borrow my car, my pristine cherry red Honda CR-V. The car I had owned for exactly 3 weeks. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "No." You have to comprehend how monumental that single syllable was for me. I do not say no to Julian. I never say no to him. It is infinitely easier to just cave in, let him have whatever he wants, and avoid the nuclear explosion that inevitably detonates when the golden child gets denied. But something about that new car, something about the blood, sweat, and independence it represented, made me plant my feet firmly on the linoleum floor. "I am not comfortable lending it out," I told him, keeping my voice level. "It is brand new. I've barely broken it in myself. You can rent a car or take an Uber. Or maybe Chloe can arrange an Uber from the airport, like a normal, functional adult does." Julian's face went through that terrifying, rapid metamorphosis. The shift from overly friendly to instantly entitled, to furiously angry, all in about 3 seconds. I have witnessed that exact shift my entire life. It usually signals that I am about to get screamed at. My dad is going to blindly take his side, and my mom is going to guilt-trip me about being more flexible. "Are you serious right now?" Julian scoffed, stepping closer. "It is one morning, Clara. I will have it parked back here by noon. Come on, don't be like this." "Like what?" I shot back. "Like someone who doesn't want to hand over the keys to her brand new vehicle? That is a pretty standard boundary, Julian." He made this disgusting, dismissive, snorting sound, as if I had just declared the sky was green. "It is not like I am going to crash it." Famous last words. Seriously, if I had possessed a crystal ball to see what was rapidly approaching, I would have had that exact phrase permanently tattooed on my forearm. It is not like I am going to crash it. The universe heard that arrogant little declaration and immediately started taking meticulous notes. Arthur wandered into the kitchen right at that exact moment, probably sensing domestic conflict the way a shark senses a drop of blood in the ocean. Julian instantaneously pivoted his strategy. "Dad, Clara won't let me borrow her car to pick up Chloe tomorrow morning. Can you please talk some sense into her?" I watched my father's aging face, hoping stupidly, pointlessly hoping that just this one time he would back me up, that he would look at his son and say, "Julian, it is her car. Respect her decision." Instead, he looked at me with a thick, suffocating blanket of disappointment. "Clara, don't be difficult. It is just one morning. Help your brother out." "Dad, it is my car," I insisted. I said no. "You are being petty," Arthur growled. "This is exactly your problem. You are always making things harder than they need to be." My mother materialized in the doorway, already anxiously wringing her hands together. "What is going on? Is everyone okay in here?" "Clara won't let Julian borrow her car," Arthur reported to her, acting as if I had committed treason. Martha looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes. "Honey, it would really help him out. You know how Chloe gets when she is stressed." "Mom," I said no. That is my final answer. No. Julian violently threw his hands in the air. "Fine, whatever. Be selfish." He stormed off toward the basement, slamming the heavy wooden door so hard the framed family photos in the hallway rattled against the drywall. Arthur just slowly shook his head at me. "I don't know why you always have to be like this." "Like what, Dad? Like a human being with an actual boundary?" He walked back to his golf tournament, leaving me standing in the kitchen feeling like a scolded 12-year-old. My mother lingered. She placed her hand gently on my forearm and whispered, "Why do you always have to make things harder? You know how your father gets. You know how Julian is. Would it have been so terrible to just say yes?" I stared at her for a long, quiet moment. This was the woman who had raised me, the woman who taught me to tie my shoelaces, and she was explicitly telling me that keeping the artificial peace with my entitled brother was vastly more important than my own property. "I have to go," I whispered. That is when I grabbed my coat and left. That Saturday night, as the temperature plummeted, I made one tiny, seemingly insignificant decision that completely altered the trajectory of our family history. The local weather forecast predicted a brutal hailstorm rolling in past midnight. My brand new Honda CR-V was sitting exposed in my parents' open driveway. My apartment complex in town only had open lots, but my best friend Sarah lived 3 blocks away in a building with a secure underground garage. She had explicitly told me weeks ago that her second parking spot was always empty and available for me to use. So, at 9:15 p.m., I decided to move my vehicle to Sarah's building. It was purely a protective measure against the weather. I grabbed my spare keys from my coat pocket, drove the Honda to the safe covered spot, and walked the 3 freezing blocks back to my parents' house to finally say my goodbyes. In my rush to escape the dropping temperature, I absent-mindedly left my primary set of keys sitting flat on the kitchen island. I didn't even process the mistake. I had my spare set on me, so I figured I would just grab the main ones the next morning when I came back for Sunday brunch. It felt like no big deal. I said a polite goodnight to my mother, waved vaguely toward the basement staircase where my brother had retreated to nurse his bruised ego, and drove home in a borrowed rental I was using while sorting out my own apartment's parking situation. It was a remarkably boring, unremarkable end to a boring, unremarkable family dinner. Except it wasn't the end at all, because within mere hours, that small, innocent choice to protect my property from a storm would brutally expose decades of family lies and initiate a chain of consequences no one could stop. At exactly 10:42 p.m., I was in my bathroom brushing my teeth when my phone violently vibrated against the porcelain sink. It was a text message from Julian. Changed my mind. Taking the car. You won't even notice. My stomach instantly dropped into my shoes. My heart began hammering against my ribs. I called his number immediately. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. My hands shaking, I dialed my mother's number. He took my car. I practically gasped into the phone, my voice vibrating with a sudden surge of panic. He took my keys from the counter, and he took my car. Honey, please calm down. Martha sighed, sounding exhausted. He is home. I just heard him walking around in the kitchen 10 minutes ago. Then why did he just text me that he is taking my car? I am sure it was just a joke. You know his attitude when he is upset. He is probably just trying to get a reaction out of you because you hurt his feelings earlier. Go to bed, Clara. Everything is fine. I desperately tried calling him 3 more times. Absolute silence. I sent him one final text. This is not funny. Bring it back. No response. But here is the beautiful, terrifying piece of dramatic irony. I didn't know what nobody else knew yet. At 10:40 p.m., my brother had confidently grabbed my keys from the kitchen island, walked outside into the freezing wind, and found absolutely nothing. My Honda wasn't there. I had already moved it to Sarah's underground garage. His text to me was pure, malicious spite. A petty little power move intended to ruin my night. He thought he was asserting dominance when there was no car to take. But my brother did not simply go to sleep and accept defeat. Instead, Julian spent the next 5 hours heavily drinking Arthur's expensive scotch and spiraling into a deep panic because Chloe was incessantly messaging him. Her flight had supposedly been rescheduled, bumped up to 5 a.m. instead of the original time. She desperately needed him to be there. Before we go any further, you need to understand Chloe. She worked 40 hours a week as a dental hygienist, paid her own rent, and drove a beat-up Chevy Cruze with 150,000 miles on it to save up for nursing school. She was absolutely exhausted from dating a guy who worked part-time, lived off his family's wealth, and still asked her to split the dinner check. The early flight was a setup. She was testing him. Chloe wasn't at the airport. She was sitting comfortably in her Denver apartment, waiting to see if Julian would actually show up for her. Spoiler alert, he did try to show up, but in the most disastrous way imaginable. Julian, drunk, desperate, and fundamentally incapable of processing the word no, made a catastrophic choice around 3:30 a.m. He stumbled into the kitchen, opened the drawer where Arthur kept the spare keys, and grabbed the heavy fob for the Lincoln Navigator. In his liquor-soaked brain, the logic was flawless. He would just stole it, and Dad would forgive him later. Dad always bailed him out. So he backed the luxury SUV out of our driveway and headed toward the highway. He never made it to Denver. At exactly 4:47 a.m., Julian was driving far too fast on the slick, rain-soaked pavement of Route 315. His blood alcohol level was 0.14, well over the legal limit. Not entirely blacked out, but impaired enough that his reflexes were sluggish and his judgment was practically non-existent. On a sharp curve, he completely lost control. The massive SUV violently slammed into the metal guardrail at over 60 miles per hour, spun out of control, hit it a second time, and finally came to rest deep in a muddy ditch. The front end of Arthur's precious vehicle was completely crumpled, like a discarded soda can. It was totally wrecked. He had officially crashed the one thing my father loved most. Julian's injuries were minor, a fractured wrist, some bruised ribs, and minor cuts. Incredibly, his first instinct was to restart the engine and flee the scene to avoid facing any real consequences. He wanted to run before anyone found out he was guilty of unauthorized use of the truck. But the engine was dead, and a passing driver had already dialed 911. By 5:05 a.m., the state police arrived. They immediately smelled the alcohol. They administered a field sobriety test, which he spectacularly failed, leading to a swift DUI charge. The troopers didn't care about his last name or his father's bank account. They just slapped cold steel handcuffs on his wrists, right there in the freezing rain. At exactly 5:45 a.m., my phone shattered the quiet of my bedroom. It was Arthur. He screamed through the speaker so loudly I had to instinctively pull the device away from my ear. "What the hell did Julian do to your car?" I sat up, my heart pounding rapidly against my ribs, completely disoriented in the dark. What? What are you even talking about?" "Do not play dumb with me, Clara. The state police just called. He crashed your car out on Route 315. He is at the hospital right now." "Dad, that is physically impossible," I said, my voice dropping to an eerily calm register. "My car is safely parked in Sarah's underground garage. It has been sitting there all night long." "Stop lying to protect yourself. They said he wrecked a vehicle. He took your keys and he ruined it." "Dad, listen to my words very carefully. My car is not at your house. I moved it before the storm. Go open the front door and look out at the driveway." There was a heavy, loaded pause. I heard the rustle of his heavy robe, the familiar squeak of the front door hinges, his bare footsteps stepping out onto the wooden porch. Then, absolute silence. A thick, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on for a lifetime. "Dad," I prodded gently into the receiver. "What do you see?" When his voice finally returned, it was nothing more than a hollow, trembling whisper. All the fiery rage had instantaneously evaporated. "The navigator, it isn't here." "What do you mean it isn't there?" I asked, though my brain was already putting the puzzle pieces together. "It is gone, Clara. My Lincoln is gone." Oh my God. I am not particularly proud of this reaction, but sitting right there in the shadows of my bedroom at 5:45 in the morning, I let out a wide, genuine smile. Julian had not destroyed my hard-earned vehicle. He had taken Arthur's precious $86,000 pride and joy. I quickly threw on some clothes and drove straight to Boulder General Hospital. The emergency room was a chaotic blur of harsh fluorescent lights and beeping monitors. Martha was uncontrollably sobbing into a damp tissue in the waiting area. Arthur was frantically pacing the linoleum floor, aggressively arguing with a stoic state trooper who clearly had zero interest in his desperate excuses. And then I saw him. The golden child was sitting upright on a hospital bed, nursing a fractured wrist, with a thick, heavy metal handcuff securely attaching his opposite arm to the steel bed rail. Yes, an actual handcuff. I walked into the cubicle, and Arthur immediately rounded on me, his eyes bloodshot. "This is entirely your fault. If you had just let him use your car—" "My car is perfectly fine," I interrupted coldly, staring him down. "Julian did not use my set. He opened your kitchen drawer, took your spare set, and drove away in your luxury SUV. The vehicle he destroyed was yours, Dad, not mine." I watched my father's aging face cycle through 5 distinct stages of grief in under 10 seconds. Deep confusion, sheer denial, horrifying realization, misplaced anger, and finally, utter, crushing defeat. He slowly turned to look at the state trooper. Is that true?" The trooper casually flipped open his notepad. "The vehicle involved is a 2023 Lincoln Navigator registered to Arthur. Your son was driving under the influence. He attempted to flee the scene before we arrived. He is officially facing a felony charge. For the very first time in 31 years, my father's checkbook could not fix the problem. Over the next 48 hours, I absorbed more about Colorado criminal law than I ever realistically wanted to comprehend. Julian wasn't just facing a standard traffic citation. He was staring down the barrel of 4 distinct charges. First, a DUI with a high blood alcohol content blowing a 0.14 is classified significantly harsher than a standard offense. Second, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. And here is the brutal kicker. In this state, when the damaged vehicle is valued over a certain high threshold, that automatically bumps the charge up. At $86,000, Julian was looking straight at a felony. He wasn't playing in minor misdemeanor territory anymore. Then came criminal mischief for obliterating the state-owned guardrail, and finally, leaving the scene of an accident because he actively attempted to restart the engine and flee. 4 charges, 1 confirmed felony, and a father who, for the absolute first time, couldn't just write a fat check to make the severe consequences disappear. I watched Arthur desperately try, though. I will give him that much credit. The day after the crash, he called everyone in his contacts: his golf buddy on the city council, a local judge he played poker with, his corporate lawyer. But state troopers do not care about local Pine Ridge politics. They had a drunk driver, a totaled luxury SUV, and irrefutable evidence. End of story. The phone call to the insurance agency was the precise moment Arthur fundamentally broke. I happened to be at the house picking up my belongings when he made it. His home office door was cracked open, and I heard every single word. Yes, Arthur speaking. Policyholder. The vehicle is a 2023 Lincoln Navigator. A very long pause. Yes, my son was driving. Another agonizing pause. I watched his face through the narrow gap in the door. The claims adjuster asked the ultimate million-dollar question. Was he an authorized driver? I witnessed the exact second Arthur calculated his trap. If he said yes, the insurance might actually cover the $86,000 damage, but that would be federal fraud. Arthur could go to prison. If he said no, the claim would be unequivocally denied, but he would stay out of a jail cell. For 28 years, my father had chosen my brother over everything else, shielding him from reality. But faced with his own ruin, he finally had to choose himself. No, Arthur choked out quietly. He was unauthorized to drive the vehicle. The adjuster responded with cheerful corporate coldness, stating that unauthorized use by a family member over the legal back limit is strictly excluded under their policy. Claim permanently denied. $86,000 vaporized into thin air. Arthur hung up the receiver and just stared blankly at his mahogany wall. Standing in the hallway, I felt absolutely nothing but clinical, calculated logic. About 3 days after the disaster, I did something I probably shouldn't have done, but my background in banking fraud makes me inherently thorough. Something about Chloe's urgent early morning flight was fundamentally flawed. I hopped onto the airport's official website and pulled up the Sunday arrival logs. Guess what? There was absolutely no 5 a.m. flight arriving in Denver that morning. Not a single one. I drove over to my parents' house and confronted Julian directly. He was out on a massive $20,000 bond, moping in the kitchen like a kicked puppy. I laid the printed flight schedules flat on the granite counter. I told him Chloe never had a flight. She was testing him, intentionally creating a high-stress scenario to see if he would respect a basic boundary or act recklessly to show up for her. Julian's face drained of all color. His hands violently trembling, he called her right there. I heard him weakly ask if she had made the whole thing up. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end, followed by Julian letting out a pathetic, choked sob. Chloe officially dumped him via a brutal 40-word text message later that afternoon. But the absolute worst consequence was still lurking in the shadows. About a week later, the local Pine Ridge newspaper ran a tiny buried paragraph about the accident. However, they printed Julian's full name. That specific article caught the eye of a local man named Victor Thorne. 3 years ago, Julian had been heavily drinking at a local tavern. He drove home intoxicated and violently sideswiped Victor's parked vehicle. Victor caught him trying to flee, but Arthur showed up in the dead of night and handed Victor $5,500 in pure cash to sweep the whole thing under the rug. No police report, no official record. But Victor was incredibly smart. He secretly recorded the entire transaction on his phone. In Colorado, Only one party needs to consent to a recording, and Victor was that party. When Victor saw the new article, he immediately forwarded that damning audio file to the district attorney. When the corporate fraud investigator finally called me for a statement regarding the denied claim, I didn't hesitate. I handed over the screenshot of Julian's malicious late-night text message. When Arthur found out I had fully cooperated, he called me, sounding completely defeated. He asked why I couldn't just protect my own blood. I calmly replied that I was finally done sacrificing my own peace for their comfort. I had stopped keeping score, and I was simply letting accountability take the wheel. The final investigative report explicitly detailed Arthur's long history of private financial settlements. Because of that audio recording, Julian wasn't just a privileged kid making a mistake anymore. He was a documented menace. Julian's legal proceedings dragged on for 6 grueling months. The district attorney, armed with the undeniable state police report and Victor Thorne's damning audio recording, refused to offer any lenient plea deals. Julian eventually pled guilty to 2 felonies. He was sentenced to 18 months in a state correctional facility, followed by 5 years of strict probation and a permanent revocation of his driver's license. For a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in flashy cars and unearned privilege, taking the public bus became his ultimate, inescapable humiliation. Arthur aged a decade in those 6 months. The $86,000 loss on the Lincoln Navigator was just the beginning. His pristine reputation in Pine Ridge was entirely shattered. The local country club quietly asked him to step down from the board of directors, politely citing the public nature of his family's legal troubles. My mother, Martha, tried desperately to keep up appearances, acting as if Julian was just away on an extended spiritual retreat. But the suffocating silence at their Sunday dinners was louder than any screaming match we had ever had. I stopped attending those dinners. Actually, I stopped communicating with them entirely. The day Julian was formally sentenced, Arthur cornered me outside the courthouse. He looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly defeated. "Are you happy now, Clara?" he asked, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of grief and lingering resentment. "You tore this family apart over a piece of metal." I looked at the man who had spent 3 decades prioritizing my brother's comfort over my basic respect, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound, overwhelming clarity. "I didn't tear anything apart, Dad," I replied quietly, pulling my car keys from my purse. "I just stopped being the glue." I turned my back on him, walked away from the heavy courthouse doors, and stepped into my beautiful, unblemished, cherry-red Honda CR-V. The engine purred to life with a quiet, reliable hum. I rolled down the windows, letting the crisp, biting Colorado air fill the cabin, and I drove out of Pine Ridge. I didn't look in the rearview mirror a single time. I finally realized that my father was completely wrong. I wasn't keeping score anymore. The game was simply over, and for the first time in my entire life, I had won by walking off the field.